She was hired to be a billionaire's fake fiancée, but she ended up changing his life. The air inside the cramped apartment was thick with the scent of stale coffee and desperation. Emilia sat at the small, wobbly kitchen table, her fingers gripping the latest hospital bill. The numbers blurred as she tried to make sense of them, but no amount of wishful thinking could change the reality. She was running out of options. Her mother's condition was worsening, and despite working 2 jobs, the debt kept piling up. Every night, Emilia told herself she would find a way. But tonight, for the first time, she felt the weight of hopelessness pressing against her chest like a vice. A sharp knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. She wasn't expecting anyone. Heart pounding, she hesitated before standing and peering through the peephole. A well-dressed man stood outside, his expression unreadable. With a deep breath, she unlocked the door. "Miss Emilia Carter?" His voice was smooth, businesslike. "Yes, who's asking?" "I'm here on behalf of Mr. Damien Blackwood. He wishes to discuss an opportunity with you." The name sent a shiver down her spine. Everyone knew who Damien Blackwood was, a ruthless billionaire, powerful and untouchable. But why would someone like him send for her? "I think you have the wrong person," she said warily. The man handed her an envelope. "You want to read this? A car is waiting downstairs." Emilia's fingers trembled as she unfolded the letter. Inside was an invitation to a private meeting, along with a sum of money simply for showing up. Her breath hitched. It was more than she made in a month. Her mother's hospital bills flashed in her mind. Minutes later, she found herself seated in the back of a sleek black car, her nerves coiling tighter with every passing streetlight. The city rushed by in a blur, and before she knew it, the car pulled up to the towering Blackwood skyscraper. The elevator ride to the top floor felt like an eternity. When the door slid open, she stepped into an opulent office. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the night skyline, the city lights twinkling like distant stars. And there, standing by the window with his back to her, was the man himself. Damien Blackwood turned slowly, his piercing gray eyes assessing her. He was as striking as he was intimidating, broad-shouldered, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his presence radiating power. "You must be wondering why you're here," he said smoothly. Emilia swallowed hard. That would be an understatement. He gestured for her to sit, then slid a folder across the polished desk. "I'll get straight to the point. I need a fiancée." She blinked, certain she had misheard him. "I'm sorry, what?" "This is a contract," he continued, unfazed. "You will pretend to be my fiancée for the next 6 months. In return, you will receive financial compensation beyond what you could earn in a lifetime." Emilia let out a breathless laugh. "This is insane. Why would you need a fake fiancé?" His expression remained unreadable. "Let's just say there are people watching my every move. A stable engagement will silence certain concerns." It was all too much. The luxurious office, the intimidating man before her, the absurdity of what he was proposing. "Why me?" she demanded. "You have no ties to my world, no ulterior motives. And most importantly, you need the money." Heat flooded her cheeks. He wasn't wrong. But the idea of selling herself, even if only as a fiancée on paper, felt impossible. "This comes with conditions," Damien continued. "You will follow my rules. No questions about my personal life. No emotional entanglements. And under no circumstances will you expect this to be real." She should have said no. She should have walked out. But the weight of her mother's illness, the suffocating debt, and the unbearable feeling of helplessness pressed against her. "Sign it," Damien urged, his gaze locked onto hers. Emilia's fingers hovered over the pen. Every fiber of her being screamed that this was a mistake. But her mother's frail face flashed in her mind. This wasn't about pride. It was about survival. With a deep breath, she signed. The ink barely dried before Damien stood. "Good. We start tomorrow." The next morning, Emilia found herself standing in front of an elegant townhouse, a far cry from the tiny apartment she had called home. Inside, a team of stylists and designers awaited her, ready to transform her into the perfect fiancée. Damien, as promised, was all business. He barely looked at her, issuing orders without warmth or interest. No unnecessary conversation in public, he reminded her. Everything must look effortless. But nothing about this felt effortless. The clothes, the extravagant dinners, the way Damien carried himself like he owned the world, it was foreign to her. And yet, she had no choice but to keep up. Their first public appearance came sooner than she had time to prepare for. A high-profile gala, swarming with cameras and elites who thrived on gossip. Damien offered his arm. Smile, he instructed under his breath. Emilia plastered on the most convincing smile she could manage, but every nerve in her body screamed that she didn't belong here. As they entered the grand ballroom, all eyes turned to them. Whispers followed. Who was she? Where did she come from? Damien played his part flawlessly, greeting influential guests with effortless charm. Emilia, however, felt like she was drowning. The polished socialites eyed her like an outsider, and every interaction felt like a test she wasn't prepared for. One woman, impossibly elegant and radiating disdain, approached them. Damien, darling, she purred, her eyes flickering to Emilia. And this must be, well, I suppose we'll all learn her name eventually. Emilia clenched her fists. She's my fiancée, Damien said flatly, his grip tightening ever so slightly on Emilia's hand. The woman laughed, a sound as sharp as glass. How charming. Emilia wanted to scream. Instead, she held her head high, refusing to let them see her falter. Later that night, when they returned to the townhouse, she whirled on Damien. You just stood there and let them treat me like I was nothing. He barely glanced at her. You let their words get to you. That's your problem, not mine. Something inside her snapped. I may be playing your fiancé, but I am not your puppet. For the first time, his expression flickered with something other than indifference. Amusement? Frustration? She couldn't tell. You agreed to this, he reminded her. You knew what this was. Emilia swallowed the lump in her throat. He was right. She had made her choice. But as she looked at the man before her, she realized something. This wasn't just about money or contracts. Somewhere beneath his calculated coldness, there was something else. Something human. And whether she wanted to or not, she was beginning to see it. The following morning, Emilia woke up in a room that wasn't hers. The silk sheets felt too smooth, the air too crisp, the space too empty. It had only been a few days since she moved into Damien's townhouse, yet every moment here felt like she was living someone else's life. The lavish walk-in closet, the marble bathroom, the elegant gowns hanging neatly in place, all of it felt foreign. She had spent her entire life working for every dime, scraping by to survive, and now she was surrounded by wealth so excessive it was suffocating. She ran her fingers through her hair and exhaled sharply. She had made a deal, and there was no turning back now. The sound of distant voices drifted through the partially open door. Pulling on a robe, she stepped into the hallway, her bare feet silent against the cold wooden floor. She needs to learn quickly. A sharp voice echoed from below. Emilia's stomach twisted. She'll manage, Damien replied coolly. She doesn't have a choice. Her breath caught. It wasn't just the words, but the way he said them, like she was nothing more than a pawn in his carefully constructed game. Steeling herself, she walked downstairs, her presence making the conversation come to an abrupt halt. Damien stood in the foyer, his phone in hand, dressed impeccably as always. Across from him stood an older man, his suit just as sharp, his expression unreadable. Good morning, Emilia said, keeping her voice even. Damien barely spared her a glance. We have an event tonight. Her heart sank. Another night of scrutiny. Another night of pretending. She folded her arms. What kind of event? A charity gala. He finally met her gaze, his tone clipped. You will dress accordingly, say as little as possible, and do exactly as I say. A bitter laugh escaped her lips before she could stop it. Of course. Wouldn't want me ruining your perfect image. The older man, whom Emilia assumed was one of Damien's advisors, arched a brow but said nothing. Damien's expression remained unreadable, but there was something behind his eyes, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. That night, she stood in front of the mirror, staring at the woman she barely recognized. The dress was a deep shade of crimson, clinging to her in all the right places, diamonds sparkling at her ears. She looked expensive. "You clean up well," Damien's voice came from behind her. She turned, finding him standing in the doorway. He looked breathtakingly effortless in his black suit, but his expression was the same as always, cold, calculated, detached. Emilia lifted her chin. "Do I meet your standards?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "Let's go." The gala was grander than the last event. Crystal chandeliers bathed the ballroom in a golden glow, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and champagne. Damien led her through the crowd, his grip firm but impersonal. They were a picture-perfect couple, but she could feel the whispers following them. "She's a nobody. He's never been interested in relationships before. She's just a distraction." Emilia clenched her jaw, fighting the urge to respond. But she knew better. This was his world, and in this world, silence was a weapon. They greeted a small group of men in tailored suits, each one oozing power and privilege. Damien spoke in measured tones, discussing investments and strategies, while Emilia stood quietly by his side. Then a woman approached, blonde, poised, and painfully familiar with Damien. Her red lips curled into a smirk as she ran her eyes over Emilia. "You must be the new fiancée," she said, voice dripping with condescension. "How charming." Emilia smiled tightly. "And you are?" The woman chuckled, her gaze shifting to Damien. "You didn't tell her about me?" Damien's expression didn't change. There was no need. Emilia's stomach twisted. The woman's eyes gleamed with amusement. "Oh, darling, you have so much to learn." Before Emilia could respond, Damien's grip on her hand tightened. "We're leaving." The car ride back was silent, tension thick in the air. Emilia stared out the window, jaw clenched, her mind racing. Finally, she turned to him. "Who was she?" Damien didn't respond. "Damien." His fingers tightened around the steering wheel. "Someone who no longer matters." Emilia scoffed. She seemed to think she mattered. He exhaled sharply. "This is exactly why I told you not to ask personal questions." Her patience snapped. "I'm supposed to parade around as your perfect fiancé, but I'm not even allowed to know the past I'm stepping into." His gaze flickered to her, something unreadable in his eyes. "You agreed to this arrangement." "Yes," she shot back, "but I didn't agree to be treated like a damn accessory." The car pulled to a stop in front of the townhouse. Without another word, Damien got out, slamming the door behind him. That night, Emilia lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. This was her life now, a web of lies, rules, and a man who seemed incapable of warmth. And yet, she had seen something beneath his mask tonight, a flicker of something real. The next morning, she awoke to the sound of voices downstairs. Slipping out of bed, she padded toward the staircase, stopping when she heard Damien's voice, low, angry. "She's not an issue." A pause. "No, she doesn't know anything." Emilia's blood ran cold. Who was he talking to? And more importantly, what didn't he want her to know? The days passed in a blur of obligations, social appearances, and carefully constructed lies. Damien remained distant, a fortress of steel, but Emilia had started noticing the cracks. The moments when his mask slipped, when his hands trembled slightly, when his gaze lingered too long, when the exhaustion bled through his carefully controlled demeanor. She wasn't sure why, but she couldn't stop looking for those moments. Then, one night, everything changed. She had been walking through the townhouse, unable to sleep, when she heard the sound of glass shattering. Heart hammering, she followed the noise to Damien's study. The door was slightly ajar, the dim glow of the desk lamp illuminating the chaos inside. Damien stood in the center of the room, his hand bleeding, shards of glass at his feet. His breathing was ragged, his expression darker than she had ever seen. "Damien," she whispered, stepping inside. His head snapped up, eyes stormy. "Go back to bed." She hesitated. "You're hurt." I said go, but she didn't. Instead, she grabbed a cloth from the desk and moved closer. "Let me help." His jaw clenched. "Why do you care?" The question made her pause. She wasn't sure, but something about seeing him like this, raw, broken, made it impossible to walk away. "I just do," she said softly. For a moment, he just stared at her. Then, finally, he let her take his hand. As she gently wrapped the cloth around his wound, their eyes met. And in that moment, Emilia realized something. Damian Blackwood wasn't as unshakable as he wanted the world to believe. And maybe, just maybe, she was the only one who could see it. The scrutiny was relentless. Every whispered conversation, every lingering glance, every calculated smile at the countless events they attended, it all held the weight of judgment. The wealthy elite didn't just accept new players into their world. They dissected them, looking for cracks, for weaknesses, for the smallest inconsistencies in the story being sold to them. And Emilia could feel it, eyes tracking her every move, waiting for her to slip. She kept her posture straight, her smile polite, but inside, she felt like she was balancing on a tightrope without a safety net. The engagement had made headlines, stirring curiosity and doubt. Why would Damian Blackwood, one of the most powerful, emotionless men in the business world, suddenly be engaged to a woman no one had heard of? The whispers surrounded her like an invisible storm. She doesn't belong here. This is nothing more than a transaction. He'll drop her the second she becomes inconvenient. Emilia clenched her fists beneath the table at yet another charity gala, pretending not to hear the murmurs around her. She glanced at Damian, who sat beside her, looking entirely unaffected. His expression was unreadable, his focus sharp as he engaged in effortless conversation with men who wielded more power than entire governments. He didn't flinch at the scrutiny. He didn't acknowledge the skepticism. He existed in a world where words were just weapons people used to manipulate the weak. And she was starting to wonder if he even considered her part of this world at all. The evening was a blur of champagne glasses clinking, hollow laughter, and carefully crafted conversations. Then, a presence shifted the air, turning the whispers into something sharper. Emilia saw her before she even spoke. A woman who moved with the confidence of someone who had always belonged. Emilia. The voice was smooth, calculated. Emilia turned, meeting the sharp blue eyes of a woman whose beauty was almost as intimidating as her presence. The blonde hair, the flawless skin, the designer gown that probably cost more than a year's rent. It was all carefully curated perfection. And suddenly, Emilia knew exactly who she was. The ex. Damian's past was like a locked vault, but even vaults left traces. She had overheard snippets, noticed the way some people spoke of a woman who had once stood exactly where Emilia stood now. "I'm surprised he didn't tell you about me," the woman continued, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. But then again, Damian always did love keeping secrets. Emilia's nails dug into her palm, but she kept her expression calm. "I'm sure if it was important, he would have mentioned it." The woman tilted her head, as if assessing something. "You're new to this world, aren't you? The way you hold yourself, the way you watch your surroundings. You're learning, but you're not one of us." Emilia's stomach twisted, not from the words themselves, but from the truth in them. She forced a polite smile. "And yet here I am." The woman chuckled, sipping her champagne. "For now." Before Emilia could respond, Damian's presence materialized beside her, his arm resting lightly against her back, his expression unreadable. "Is there a reason you're bothering my fiancée, Evelyn?" Evelyn's smirk didn't falter. "Just making conversation." She turned back to Emilia, her voice laced with something Emilia couldn't quite name. "I do hope you're prepared for what comes next." With that, she turned and disappeared into the sea of socialites, leaving Emilia with a sense of unease that clung to her like a second skin. Later that evening, she sat in silence on the drive home, Damian's presence beside her feeling heavier than ever. The air between them was thick with words unsaid, but she refused to be the first to break the silence. When they finally reached the townhouse, she stepped out of the car without waiting for him, heading toward the stairs. But his voice stopped her. "She was trying to rattle you." Emilia turned, arms crossed. "And you let her." His jaw tightened. "It wouldn't have mattered what I said. People will believe what they want to believe." She let out a bitter laugh. "You could have at least pretended to care." For the first time that night, something flickered in his expression. "And what good would that do?" She shook her head, exhaustion creeping into her bones. "You know what? Forget it. She turned and walked away, leaving Damien standing in the dimly lit hallway, alone with whatever thoughts he refused to share. The next event was worse. The skepticism had sharpened, and Evelyn was no longer the only one testing Emilia. It happened so quickly that she barely had time to react. A waiter, seemingly flustered, stumbled near her, and before she knew it, red wine splashed across the front of her gown. The crowd gasped, the whispers rising instantly. "Oh dear," someone murmured. "That's unfortunate," another voice said, laced with amusement. Emilia felt the heat of humiliation creep up her neck. She could feel the eyes, the judgment, the quiet satisfaction of those who had been waiting for her to make a misstep. She turned, searching for Damien, expecting, hoping that he would say something, do something. But he just stood there, watching, silent. Something inside her cracked. She lifted her chin, refusing to give them the reaction they wanted. With measured grace, she grabbed a napkin, dabbing at the stain before giving a small, amused smile. "Well, I suppose red is more dramatic anyway." The tension in the air shifted, some people chuckling, others exchanging glances. But Emilia didn't care. She had handled herself. Without him. Later that night, when they were alone, she finally confronted him. "You just stood there." Damien, who had been unbuttoning his cuffs, paused. "What did you want me to do?" "Something," she snapped. "Anything. But you just watched like it wasn't your problem." His expression didn't change. It wasn't. Her breath hitched. "You dragged me into this world, Damien. You made me part of your game. And the least you could do is—" "What?" he interrupted, his voice dangerously low. "Protect you." She clenched her fists. Yes. Something flickered in his eyes, something dark and unreadable. He took a step closer, his voice quieter but no less sharp. "This world isn't fair, Emilia. And you don't survive it by expecting someone else to fight your battles." She swallowed, her pulse racing. "And what about you? Are you even fighting your own?" For the first time, his mask slipped, just for a second. And in that second, Emilia saw something in his eyes that shook her. Something that told her he had spent a lifetime fighting battles no one had ever seen. And maybe he didn't know how to let someone fight beside him. But she wasn't sure if she wanted to be the one to teach him. Because if she did, she might not be able to walk away. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. Emilia didn't know what answer she had been expecting from him. Maybe an apology, maybe an explanation. But all she got was that same cold, detached expression, as if none of this mattered to him. But it did matter. Maybe not to Damien, but to her. She let out a slow breath, forcing herself to unclench her fists. "You know what? You're right. This world isn't fair. But you're wrong about something." Damien's gaze remained steady, his expression unreadable. "I'm not asking you to fight my battles," she said. "I just want to know if I'm mattered enough for you to even try." For the briefest second, something shifted in his expression. But then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, buried beneath that impenetrable mask of his. Emilia didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked away, slamming the bedroom door behind her. She refused to cry, but sleep didn't come easily that night. The next morning, she woke up with a renewed sense of determination. If Damien Blackwood thought she was going to cower, if he thought she was going to quietly accept the way things were, he was wrong. If she was going to survive in his world, she needed to learn to play by its rules. She just wasn't sure if that meant following them or breaking them. The tension between them didn't fade. If anything, it grew thicker with every passing day. Emilia played her role perfectly, smiling when needed, standing by Damien's side at events, enduring the whispers and scrutiny. But behind closed doors, things were different. Their conversations were clipped, their interactions laced with unspoken frustration. She didn't trust him, and he didn't let her in. But then something shifted. It was a small moment, one she might have overlooked if she hadn't been paying attention. One night, unable to sleep, Emilia wandered downstairs for a glass of water. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the antique clock in the hallway. But as she passed the study, she heard something. A voice. Damien's. She paused, peeking through the barely opened door. He was on the phone, his back to her, one hand clenched into a fist. His voice was low, strained. I don't care what it costs. Just make sure it gets done. A pause. Then, no, I don't want her to know. Emilia's heart skipped a beat. Her? Was he talking about her? She took a quiet step back, not wanting to get caught. But before she could slip away, Damien turned. Their eyes met. For a second, neither of them moved. Then, he sighed and ended the call. You shouldn't be eavesdropping. Emilia crossed her arms. You shouldn't be keeping secrets. A ghost of a smirk touched his lips, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Some things are better left unknown. She hesitated. Were you talking about me? Damien didn't answer right away. Then, after a moment, he said, Go back to bed, Emilia. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. That night, she lay awake, replaying the conversation over and over. Something about his voice, the tension in his shoulders. It wasn't just business. It was personal. And for the first time, she wondered if there was more to this arrangement than what she had signed up for. The cracks in Damien's armor became more apparent after that night. It wasn't much, just small glimpses. The way his gaze lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. The way his jaw clenched when someone at an event spoke to her for too long. The way his hands curled into fists when she laughed at another man's joke. And then there was the moment that changed everything. It happened at yet another high-profile gathering, an art exhibit this time. Emilia was used to being paraded around like a carefully placed accessory, used to pretending she belonged among people who had never faced a real struggle in their lives. She was also used to the looks, the suspicion, the curiosity, the subtle disdain. But she wasn't prepared for him. Nicholas Hale, tall, charming, and completely unbothered by the whispers surrounding her. He approached her with an easy confidence, a glass of champagne in hand. You look like you could use an escape. Emilia raised an eyebrow. And you thinking my best option? Nicholas chuckled. Well, I'm certainly more entertaining than watching your fiancé stare holes into the back of my head. Her breath hitched. Slowly, she turned her head. Damien was across the room, speaking with someone, but his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were locked onto them. It wasn't just observation. It was possession. Emilia turned back to Nicholas, forcing a smile. I didn't realize he was paying attention. Nicholas smirked. Oh, he is. And if I were a lesser man, I'd be terrified. She let out a soft laugh, but inside, her mind was racing. Because Nicholas was right. Damien wasn't indifferent, and she wasn't sure how she felt about that. As the evening went on, the tension only grew. Nicholas continued to hover, and Damien continued to watch. Then, as she reached for a drink, a hand closed around her wrist. Warm, firm, unyielding. Damien, he didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was enough. Without giving her a chance to protest, he led her away from the crowd, into a quiet hallway where the sounds of the party faded into a distant hum. Emilia wrenched her wrist free, glaring at him. What the hell was that? His jaw tightened. You shouldn't let men like Nicholas get too close. She let out a disbelieving laugh. And why do you care? Damien didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step closer, his voice low. Because you're mine. Her breath caught. For a moment, she forgot how to speak, how to move. Then, finally, she found her voice. No, Damien, she whispered. I'm not. His eyes darkened, something dangerous flashing across them. But before he could say another word, she turned and walked away. Her heart was pounding, her hands shaking. Because for the first time since this whole thing started, she wasn't sure who was really in control. And that terrified her. The tension between them didn't fade after that night. If anything, it only grew stronger, an invisible thread tightening around them, pulling them towards something neither of them fully understood. Damien didn't speak of what had happened at the art exhibit, and Emilia didn't bring it up either, but the way he looked at her changed. There was something more, something deeper, beneath his cold, calculated exterior, and it unnerved her. She wasn't naive enough to mistake possession for affection. She knew the difference. She had lived it. But with Damien, things weren't so simple. It wasn't just the way his grip had tightened around her wrist or the way his voice had dropped when he told her she was his. It was the way his gaze lingered a second too long when he thought she wasn't paying attention. The way his fingers twitched as if resisting the urge to touch her. The way he didn't leave her side for the rest of the night. But if he thought his sudden protectiveness would scare her into obedience, he was wrong. Emilia had made peace with the fact that she would never fully belong in his world, but she wouldn't be controlled by it either. The next morning, she dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue dress that was elegant yet understated. She had a role to play, and she would play it well. If Damien wanted to claim her in public, then she would make him question what that truly meant. Breakfast was quiet, tension thick between them. Damien sat across from her, sipping his coffee, his expression unreadable. Emilia met his gaze head-on. "You were acting strange last night." His grip on the coffee cup tightened slightly. "Was I?" "Yes," she said, tilting her head. "I don't know if you were being possessive or just trying to maintain the illusion of control." Damien set his cup down with a quiet clink. "And what do you think?" She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but firm. "I think you don't know either." For the first time, something flickered across his face, something raw, unguarded, but it was gone before she could place it. "I have a meeting," he said abruptly, pushing back his chair and standing. "We'll talk later." She let out a small, humorless laugh. "Of course, because avoidance is so much easier than honesty." He didn't respond, just turned and walked away. And just like that, she realized something. Damien Blackwood, the man with the world at his feet, the man who controlled everything and everyone around him, was afraid of her, or maybe, more accurately, of what she made him feel. The days that followed were filled with an unspoken battle of wills. Emilia continued to challenge him in subtle ways, lingering a little too long in conversations with other men, pushing his rules just enough to provoke a reaction. She wanted to see how far she could go before he cracked. It happened sooner than she expected. They were at another social event, this one hosted an extravagant estate just outside the city. It was the kind of gathering where wealth and power dripped from the walls, where people spoke in carefully measured words, where smiles were laced with hidden threats. And in the middle of it all, Emilia played her part perfectly. She smiled when necessary, engaged in light conversation, kept up the illusion that she and Damien were the perfect couple. But then Nicholas Hale reappeared. He found her near the balcony, a glass of champagne in hand, his smile easy and confident. "You look bored." She smirked. "I'm not sure I'm allowed to admit that." Nicholas chuckled, leaning slightly closer. "You do realize this whole engagement thing isn't fooling anyone, right?" Her breath hitched slightly, but she kept her expression composed. "And what makes you so sure?" He tilted his head, studying her. "Because I've seen real couples before. And whatever you and Damien are, it's not real." Her fingers tightened around her glass. "Tell me something, Emilia," Nicholas continued, his voice dropping just enough to make the moment feel intimate. "Why are you really here?" Before she could answer, a presence loomed behind her. Damien. She didn't even need to turn around to know it was him. The shift in the air, the sudden tension in Nicholas's shoulders, it was unmistakable. Nicholas took a step back, his smirk never quite fading. "Speak of the devil." Damien's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "Nicholas." Nicholas raised his glass slightly in mock acknowledgement. "Damien, always a pleasure." Emilia glanced at Damien, waiting for him to say something, anything, but instead he simply placed a hand on the small of her back. A silent, deliberate gesture. Possessive. She stiffened slightly, but didn't pull away. Nicholas's gaze flickered to the touch, and his smirk deepened. "Ah, I see how it is." Damien didn't respond. He didn't need to. Nicholas let out a low chuckle. "I'll leave you two to it, then." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. The moment he was gone, Emilia turned to Damien, her jaw tight. What the hell was that? Damien's eyes were dark, unreadable. He was getting too close. She let out a frustrated laugh. "And what? You think you can just—" "I don't like when other men touch what's mine." Silence. A slow, dangerous kind of silence. Emilia took a step back, her heart hammering. "I'm not yours, Damien." His gaze locked onto hers. "Aren't you?" She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him that this was nothing but a contract, a lie they were both living. But the way he was looking at her, the way his voice had dropped to something almost desperate, left her breathless. She hated him in that moment, because he was right, not in the way he meant, not in the way he wanted, but because, despite everything, despite the lies and the rules and the cold, calculated arrangement between them, somehow he had gotten under her skin, and she wasn't sure she knew how to undo it. Later that night, she couldn't sleep. She stood by the window of their shared estate, staring out at the city lights. She didn't hear him approach, but she felt him. Damien stopped a few feet behind her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, he broke the silence. "Nicholas isn't who he seems." She turned slightly, frowning. "What do you mean?" Damien's expression was unreadable. "He has his own agenda. He's trying to get close to you, for a reason." Emilia let out a dry laugh. "Oh, and I suppose you're concerned for my well-being?" His jaw tightened. "Believe it or not, yes." She studied him, searching for any sign of deception. And for the first time, she didn't find it. That terrified her more than anything. Because if Damien Blackwood, cold, calculated, emotionless Damien, was telling the truth, then she wasn't the only one losing control. He was too, and that changed everything. The morning started like any other, but Emilia quickly realized something was wrong when she walked into the dining room and found Damien already seated, a newspaper in his hands. He wasn't reading it, though. He was staring at a particular page, his grip tightening slightly around the edges. The air was heavy with something unspoken, something dangerous. Emilia hesitated for a moment before stepping closer, her eyes drifting to the table where several tabloids lay scattered. Her stomach dropped. On the front page, in bold, unforgiving letters, was her name, accompanied by a photograph of her and Damien from the last event. But the headline was what made her blood turn cold. "From rags to riches. Another gold digger sets her sights on Damien Blackwood." Her breath hitched as she reached for the paper, her fingers trembling. Scanning the article, she felt the weight of each cruel word. They had twisted everything. Her background, her engagement, even her presence at these high society events. They painted her as nothing more than a woman chasing wealth and power. Another name on a long list of opportunists who had tried to secure a place at Damien's side. She let out a shaky breath and glanced at him. "Did you see this?" His expression remained unreadable, his gray eyes cool and detached. "I did." Emilia clenched her jaw, and he folded the newspaper and set it aside. "They'll say what they want. It doesn't matter." Her heart pounded against her ribs. "It doesn't matter? Damien, they're calling me a gold digger. They're dragging my name through the mud, and you think that doesn't matter?" He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple as if this conversation was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "Emilia, if you let them get to you, they win." She let out a bitter laugh. "Easy for you to say. You're untouchable. You've lived in this world your entire life. No one questions your place in it." His jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. Emilia shook her head, stepping back. "Is this what you wanted? A perfect little arrangement where I play the role of your fiancée while everyone assumes I'm after your fortune? Was that part of the plan?" His gaze darkened. "You think I planned this?" "I don't know." She shot back, her voice rising. "But I deserve to know. Am I just another pawn in whatever game you're playing?" For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Damien stood, walking toward her with slow, deliberate steps. When he reached her, he leaned in slightly, his voice low and controlled. "You're not a pawn, Emilia." She swallowed hard, refusing to let herself be swayed by the quiet intensity in his eyes. "Then what am I?" His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but at the last second, he pulled away. "That's up to you," he said before turning and walking out of the room, leaving her standing there with more questions than answers. The next few days were unbearable. Wherever she went, whispers followed. Eyes lingered a little too long, and conversations halted the moment she entered a room. It wasn't just the tabloid articles. The rumors had taken on a life of their own. Socialites speculated about how long she would last. Business elites muttered about Damien's poor judgment, and strangers on the internet tore her apart as if they knew her personally. She tried to ignore it. She told herself that none of these people mattered. But the weight of their judgment pressed down on her, suffocating and relentless. And Damien? He remained the same. Cold, unbothered. But beneath his carefully maintained exterior, she could sense something shifting. It was in the way his gaze lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. The way his fingers hovered just a second too long before pulling away when they brushed against hers. The way he stood slightly closer when they attended events, as if shielding her from unseen dangers. One evening, as she sat in the study flipping through a book she wasn't really reading, she felt his presence before he spoke. "You're quieter than usual," Damien said from the doorway. She didn't look up. "Maybe I'm tired of talking to people who already made up their minds about me." He walked in, taking the seat across from her. "You can't control what they say." She sighed, closing the book. "I know that, but it doesn't make it any easier." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, unexpectedly, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "They said worse things about my mother." Emilia's breath caught. It was the first time Damien had ever mentioned her. She knew little about his past, only what the media had selectively chosen to report. His mother had died when he was young, but beyond that, details were scarce. She wasn't like them, he continued, his voice quieter now. She didn't belong in their world, and they never let her forget it. Emilia's fingers curled around the edge of the book. How did she handle it? Damien's expression darkened. She didn't. The weight of his words settled heavily between them. She wanted to reach for him, to touch his hand, to offer something, anything, that might soften whatever wounds he still carried. But she knew he wouldn't allow it. Instead, she whispered, "I'm not her, Damien." His gaze snapped to hers. "I can handle this," she continued. "But that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt." Something flickered in his eyes, something almost vulnerable. But, as always, he buried it beneath layers of indifference. He stood. "Get some rest. We have another event tomorrow." And just like that, the moment was gone. The following night, Emilia braced herself for yet another social gathering, knowing full well that the whispers hadn't died down. If anything, they had only grown louder. She had barely stepped inside when she felt it, an unmistakable shift in the air. A woman stood near the grand staircase, dressed in a deep red gown that hugged her slender frame. Her beauty was sharp, almost cold, and the moment she spotted Emilia, her lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Damien's entire body tensed beside her. The woman's eyes flickered to him, amusement dancing in her gaze. Well, I must say, I didn't expect this." Emilia didn't know who she was, but the familiarity between her and Damien was unmistakable. The woman stepped closer, her voice dripping with something almost playful. "You must be Emilia." Emilia forced herself to hold her ground. "And you are?" The woman tilted her head, her smirk widening. "I'm the one who knows him better than anyone else." A chill ran down Emilia's spine. Damien's jaw tightened. Lena's gaze never left Emilia. "Did he ever tell you about us?" Emilia's heart pounded. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected the past to walk in, draped in silk and secrets, ready to unravel everything she thought she knew. And from a look in Damien's eyes, neither had he. Emilia's fingers instinctively curled into fists at her sides, though she willed herself to remain composed. She had faced whispers, rumors, and judgmental stares before, but this was different. This wasn't an attack from faceless critics. This was something personal. Lena stood before her, exuding effortless confidence, her smirk laced with something far too knowing. There was a silent challenge in her eyes, a quiet warning that Emilia had no business being here. Damien's silence didn't help. Emilia stole a glance at him, searching for some indication of how to react, but his expression was unreadable. His entire posture had shifted, his usually relaxed demeanor now tense, shoulders squared as if bracing for an impact that had already arrived. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words. Then, Lena tilted her head slightly, amusement flickering in her eyes. "No response? That's disappointing." She turned her gaze back to Damien. "I expected you to have better taste, or at least better judgment." Something inside Emilia snapped. She lifted her chin. and I expected an ex to have more dignity. Lena's eyebrows rose in mock surprise, but the amusement in her eyes only deepened. "Oh, sweetheart," she cooed, stepping closer, lowering her voice to something just above a whisper. "I was never just an ex." Emilia's heart slammed against her ribs, but she refused to let the words rattle her. She wouldn't give this woman the satisfaction. Instead, she turned her attention back to Damien. "Are you going to say something?" Her voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Damien's jaw clenched. For a moment, he remained silent, and that silence was louder than anything he could have said. Lena laughed softly. "I think that's your answer." The weight of the moment pressed down on Emilia, but she refused to show it. Not here, not in front of her. With a forced smile, she straightened her posture. "I'd say it was nice meeting you, but I don't like to lie." And with that, she turned and walked away. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she weaved through the crowd, needing air, needing distance. The ballroom felt suffocating, the chandeliers too bright, the murmurs of the guests grating against her nerves. She barely registered the murmured greetings from passing socialites, barely felt the champagne glass pressed in her hand by a waiter. She didn't stop until she was outside on the balcony, the cool night air hitting her like a welcome relief. Her fingers tightened around the glass. She shouldn't care. She had known from the beginning that this engagement wasn't real. She had agreed to it, knowing full well what it was. A transaction, an arrangement. But that didn't explain the ache in her chest. It didn't explain why Lena's words felt like tiny, well-aimed knives. "Running away, are we?" Emilia's grip tightened on the railing at the sound of Damien's voice. She didn't turn. "I just needed some air." A pause. Then, "Lena shouldn't have spoken to you like that." Emilia let out a bitter laugh. "And yet, you let her." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved beside her, resting his hands on the railing as he stared out into the night. It wasn't worth causing a scene. She turned her head, watching him. "Not worth defending me, you mean?" His gaze flickered to her, something unreadable in his expression. "That's not what I meant." Emilia exhaled sharply, looking away. "You didn't even deny what she said." Another beat of silence. Then, quietly, because some of it was true, the words sent a sharp sting through her, even though she had no right to feel hurt. She had always known Damien wasn't the type to wear his heart on his sleeve. He had always been distant, untouchable. But now, standing here with the weight of unspoken truths between them, it felt different. "Did you love her?" The question left her lips before she could stop it. He didn't answer immediately, and the hesitation was enough. Finally, he exhaled. "I thought I did." She turned her head, searching his face. "And now?" His eyes darkened. "Now I know better." There was something in his voice, something almost bitter, and Emilia realized there was more to the story than what Lena had implied. But she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Before she could say anything else, the sound of heels clicking against the marble floor behind them made her stiffen. Lena's voice was smooth as silk. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Emilia clenched her jaw before forcing herself to turn, schooling her features into neutrality. "Did you need something?" Lena took a slow sip from her glass, eyes glinting with something almost predatory. "Oh, nothing in particular. I just find it fascinating." Emilia crossed her arms. "Find what fascinating?" Lena's lips curled. "How some people convince themselves they matter." Before Emilia could respond, Damien spoke, his voice sharp. "That's enough, Lena." Lena arched a brow. "Oh, are we feeling protective now?" Damien's eyes were like steel. "You shouldn't have come here." A slow, satisfied smile spread across Lena's face. "And yet I did." She set her glass down on the railing. "Tell me something, Emilia. Has he told you how this will end yet?" Emilia forced herself to hold her ground. "I don't need you to tell me what I already know." Lena chuckled. "Oh, sweetheart, I don't think you do." She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He doesn't do love. He doesn't do forever. When this little arrangement is over, he'll walk away without looking back. Just like he always does." Emilia's breath caught in her throat, but she refused to let Lena see her falter. Damien's expression remained cold. "You should leave." Lena sighed, feigning disappointment. So serious. So predictable. She gave Emilia one last glance before turning to leave. Enjoy the illusion while it lasts, darling. Emilia watched her disappear back into the crowd, a storm of emotions churning inside her. Damien remained silent beside her, his hands still resting on the railing. She turned to him, her voice quiet. Is she right? His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. That was all the answer she needed. A lump formed in her throat, but she forced herself to push it down. She had known from the start what this was, and yet, somewhere along the way, she had let herself forget. She turned away. I think I'm done for the night. She didn't wait for his response as she walked back inside, ignoring the eyes that followed her, ignoring the way her heart felt heavier with each step. For the first time since this whole arrangement began, Emilia wasn't sure she wanted to know how it would end. But she had the sinking feeling she already did. The drive back to Damien's penthouse was suffocatingly silent. Emilia sat with her hands clasped in her lap, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past. Damien, sitting beside her, was just as motionless, his sharp gaze fixed straight ahead, his expression unreadable. The tension between them was thick, unspoken words lingering in the air like ghosts. Lena's words played over and over in Emilia's mind, each syllable pressing deeper into her chest. He doesn't do love. He doesn't do forever. She wanted to dismiss it, wanted to tell herself that Lena was just another bitter ex trying to stir trouble. But the worst part, the part she couldn't ignore, was that Damien hadn't denied it. The car slowed as they pulled into the underground parking lot of his building. The moment the driver stopped, Emilia unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out before Damien could say anything. She didn't want to be near him right now. She didn't trust herself to hold back what she was feeling. She walked ahead, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she made her way to the private elevator. The moment the doors slid shut behind them, the tension became unbearable. Damien finally spoke. Are you going to talk to me, or keep pretending I'm not here? Emilia let out a quiet, humorless laugh. And what exactly do you want me to say? She turned to face him, arms crossed. That Lena was wrong? That this whole thing isn't just an act for you? Damien exhaled, tilting his head slightly. I never promised you anything else, Emilia. Her heart twisted painfully, but she refused to let it show. I know, she murmured, her voice softer now. But that doesn't make it any easier. For a moment, he just looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, in a rare moment of honesty, he muttered, Lena doesn't know everything. Emilia's brows furrowed. Then tell me what she doesn't know. A shadow passed over his face, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. But before he could answer, the elevator doors opened to his penthouse. Without another word, he stepped out, leaving Emilia standing there, staring after him. Emilia barely slept that night. She tossed and turned in the massive bed, her mind plagued with questions that had no answers. When morning finally arrived, she decided she couldn't just sit and wait for Damien to explain himself. So she started looking for answers on her own. She wasn't sure what she was hoping to find, but something about Lena's smug expression, the way she had spoken with such certainty, made Emilia feel like there was more to the story than Damien let on. And so, she searched. She spent hours scrolling through old news articles, buried socialite gossip, anything that could give her some insight into the man she was engaged to. She already knew about his wealth, his ruthless business tactics, his icy reputation. But what she found next made her breath catch in her throat. An old newspaper clipping, tucked away in the depths of the internet. Billionaire son abandoned by mother in hotel scandal. Emilia's stomach twisted as she scanned the article. It was old, probably from when Damien was a child, but the details were clear. His mother had left him in a hotel room when he was barely 7 years old, vanished without a trace. He had been found hours later, alone, confused, with no idea where she had gone. Emilia swallowed hard. She kept reading, learning how he had been taken in by his father, a man just as cold and ruthless as Damien would later become. No warmth, no love, just expectations. A sharp ache filled her chest as the pieces started clicking together. She understood now. Damien wasn't just guarded. He had been taught that love was conditional, that people could leave without warning, that the only thing he could truly rely on was himself. No wonder he didn't believe in forever. No wonder he kept his heart locked away. She closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, exhaling shakily. The urge to go to him, to tell him she understood, was overwhelming. But would he even listen? Would he even want her to know? That night, Emilia found herself standing outside Damien's home office. She hesitated for a moment before knocking lightly. "Come in," came his cool voice. She pushed open the door to find him sitting at his desk, sleeves rolled up, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His expression barely changed when he saw her. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, taking a slow sip. Emilia stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "No, you—" He let out a quiet scoff. "I don't sleep much." Silence stretched between them. Finally, she took a breath. "I read something today." Damien's jaw tightened slightly, and she hesitated before speaking. "About your mother." His entire body went still. For a long moment, he didn't move, didn't speak. When he finally did, his voice was lower, sharper. "And what exactly did you read?" Emilia swallowed hard. "That she left you." His grip on the glass tightened, but his expression remained unreadable. "That was a long time ago." She stepped closer. "I'm sorry." His eyes flicked up to hers, something unreadable in them. "Why?" She frowned. "Because no child deserves that." "Because—" She hesitated, then softened her voice. "Because I think I understand you a little better now." Damien exhaled slowly, setting his glass down. "You think knowing one thing about my past changes anything?" "It makes things make sense," she said quietly. "The way you are. The way you push people away." His gaze darkened. "Emilia." She shook her head. "I know you don't believe in love. I know you think this arrangement is nothing more than a deal. But I don't believe you're as indifferent as you pretend to be." Damien's jaw tensed, but he didn't argue. Instead, after a long pause, he murmured, "Go to bed, Emilia." She let out a soft breath, knowing she had pushed as far as he would allow. But she also knew that, for the first time, something had cracked in his armor, and she wasn't going to pretend she didn't see it. The next morning, Emilia woke to the sound of hushed voices outside her bedroom door. Frowning, she got up and opened it just in time to hear a woman's voice say, "You can't ignore me forever, Damien." Emilia's blood ran cold. Stepping into the hallway, she saw a woman standing by the entrance, a striking figure with piercing eyes and an air of confidence. Damien stood in front of her, expression unreadable, body tense. The woman's gaze flicked to Emilia. Her lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. "You must be Emilia," she said smoothly. "I've heard so much about you." Emilia swallowed hard. "And you are?" The woman's smile widened. "Someone who knows Damien better than anyone else." A chill ran down Emilia's spine. Damien's voice was clipped, sharp. "Leave, Victoria." But Victoria just chuckled, her gaze never leaving Emilia. "Oh, Damien," she murmured. "You haven't told her about me yet, have you?" Emilia's stomach twisted as the weight of her words sank in. She had no idea who Victoria was, but she was about to find out. The air in the penthouse felt heavier than usual, suffocating even. Emilia stood frozen in the doorway of Damien's office, her breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. There, standing far too close to Damien, was Victoria, the woman from his past, the one who had appeared like a ghost and made herself at home in his world. Her hand was resting lightly on his chest, her lips curved into a knowing smirk as if she had already won some unspoken battle. And the worst part? Damien wasn't pushing her away. He wasn't holding her, wasn't reciprocating her touch, but he also wasn't rejecting it outright. That single hesitation, that single moment of silence, shattered something inside Emilia. A sharp pain sliced through her chest, and her vision blurred. She had been so foolish to believe there was something real between them, that she had somehow managed to break through his cold exterior. But she understood now. She had been nothing more than a placeholder, a convenient distraction, a temporary solution until someone more fitting, someone like her, stepped back into his life. Victoria must have sensed Emilia's presence because she turned her head ever so slightly, her smirk deepening when she saw her standing there. "Oh," she said, her voice dripping with feigned surprise. "You're still here." The words hit Emilia like a slap. Still here. As if she were an afterthought. As if she had been meant to leave long before this moment. Damien turned then, his gaze locking onto Emilia's, and for a brief second, something flashed in his eyes, shock, maybe even guilt. But it didn't matter. It was already too late. Emilia didn't wait to hear whatever excuse he had prepared. She spun on her heel and rushed out of the room, her heart hammering so violently it felt like it would burst from her chest. The world outside his office felt too bright, too sharp as she hurried down the hallway. "Emilia!" Damien's voice rang out behind her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Her breath came out in uneven gasps as she reached the bedroom and slammed the door behind her. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against the wood, willing herself to keep it together, to not fall apart. But the weight of everything crashed down on her all at once. Had she really believed he could change? That he could love? A bitter laugh escaped her lips. She had been so naive, so desperate to believe that the connection she felt with him was real. But it had all been an illusion, hadn't it? A carefully constructed game that she had fallen for, just like all the others before her. She closed her eyes, swallowing the lump in her throat. She had to leave. She had to get out before she made an even bigger fool of herself. She started moving without thinking, grabbing the nearest suitcase and yanking open the closet. She didn't own much here, just a few things she had slowly brought over, items she had never even realized made this place feel like home. But it wasn't home, was it? It never had been. A sharp knock at the door made her stiffen. "Emilia." Damien's voice was quieter now, almost hesitant. She ignored him, shoving her clothes into the bag with trembling hands. Another knock. "Let me explain." Explain what? That he had never cared? That she had been nothing more than a pawn in whatever twisted game he was playing? "I don't want to hear it," she bit out, zipping up her bag with more force than necessary. A long silence stretched between them. Then, in a voice she almost didn't recognize, he murmured, "Please, please." That one word nearly broke her. But she couldn't let it. Taking a deep breath, she walked over to the door and yanked it open. Damien stood there, looking at her with an expression she had never seen before. Something raw, something almost vulnerable. But it wasn't enough. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. His jaw tightened. "You don't understand." "Understand perfectly," she cut him off. "I was a fool to think you were any different, that I meant something to you." His hands clenched at his sides. "You do mean something to me." A hollow laugh escaped her. "Right. That's why you stood there and let her touch you. That's why you didn't push her away." His eyes darkened. "I was caught off guard." "Caught off guard," Emilia repeated, incredulous. "You hesitated, Damien, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know." His throat bobbed as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. And that was answer enough. She turned, grabbing her bag and stepping past him. This time, he didn't stop her. The Grand Charity Gala was supposed to be one of the most elegant events of the year, filled with powerful elites, glittering chandeliers, and carefully crafted smiles. Emilia had only come because she was obligated to. It was one of the last events she had promised to attend as Damien's fiancée, an engagement that was now nothing more than a formality, a ticking clock counting down to her departure. But she wasn't prepared for what happened next. Victoria was there. Of course she was, and she had been waiting. As the guests mingled, sipping champagne and exchanging pleasantries, Victoria made her move. She stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand, her striking features lit up by the golden glow of the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice as smooth as silk, "I'd like to take a moment to address something that has been on everyone's minds." The crowd quieted, intrigued. Emilia's stomach twisted with unease. "I think it's time we acknowledge the truth," Victoria continued, her gaze flickering to Emilia with a cruel glint. "We all know why she's really here." A murmur spread through the room. Emilia's blood ran cold. "She's not one of us," Victoria went on, her tone dripping with condescension. "She never was. She's just another girl who saw an opportunity and took it. Laughter rippled through the audience. Emilia felt like she had been punched in the stomach. Damien was standing near the front, his expression unreadable. He could stop this. He could end this. But he didn't. He just stood there silent. And that was the final betrayal. Emilia turned and walked out. She didn't look back. The penthouse felt empty when she returned to pack the rest of her things. Maybe because it was empty, or maybe because for the first time, she wasn't fooling herself into thinking it had ever been hers to begin with. She moved through the space with quiet efficiency, her movements mechanical. She had nothing left to say. No final words. She was done. By the time Damien finally came home, she was standing by the door, suitcase in hand. His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, there was no mask, no arrogance. Just exhaustion. "You don't have to go," he said, his voice rough. She smiled sadly. "Yes, I do." A long silence stretched between them. "Emilia," he started, but she shook her head. "It's too late, Damien." She turned, gripping the handle of her suitcase, and stepped out. And this time, she wasn't coming back. The days passed in a blur. She should have felt free, relieved, but all she felt was hollow. And Damien? For the first time in his life, he realized he had lost something that actually mattered. His mansion felt too big, his life too empty, and for the first time ever, he was afraid. Afraid that he had lost the only person who had ever truly seen him, and that she wasn't coming back. But if there was one thing he knew how to do, it was fight. And this time, he was fighting for her. The days without Emilia stretched into weeks, and with each passing moment, Damien felt the suffocating weight of her absence pressing down on him. His empire was intact, his wealth untouched, and the world still bowed at his feet, but none of it mattered. Every time he walked into a room, he expected to see her. He thought he would hear her soft laughter drifting through the halls, see her curled up with a book in the library, or find her standing by the window, lost in thought. But she was gone, and the silence she left behind was unbearable. At first, he had told himself that time would fix everything, that she would cool down, and he could find the right words to explain, to make her understand. But she hadn't just left him, she had disappeared. No trace of her remained. He tried calling, but her number had been disconnected. He sent people to look for her, but they came back empty-handed. It was as if she had vanished from the face of the earth. And as the days turned into sleepless nights, Damien found himself confronting a truth he had spent his whole life avoiding. He hadn't just lost a woman. He had lost the woman. The only one who had ever made him feel like more than a man with power. The only one who had ever truly seen him. And he had let her walk away. The realization clawed at his insides, forcing him to look at himself in a way he never had before. He had spent so many years building walls, believing that control was the only way to survive, that emotions were a weakness he couldn't afford. But Emilia had changed all of that without even trying. She had stepped into his world and made it brighter, made him better. And he had repaid her by proving every fear she had about men like him to be true. He had let her believe she was replaceable, that she was nothing more than a pawn in his life. He had hesitated when she needed him most, and now he was paying the price. With renewed determination, Damien threw himself into finding her. He pulled every string, called in every favor, but no matter where he searched, he always hit a dead end. It was as if she had planned her escape too well, leaving no trace for him to follow. Frustration turned to desperation, and in his search, he stumbled upon something he never expected. It had started as a simple background check, an attempt to dig into her past to see if there was anywhere she might have gone. But the deeper he looked, the more he uncovered. His investigators came across old records, buried legal documents, whispers of a connection between their families that neither of them had known existed. At first, he had dismissed it as a coincidence, but the more he dug, the more the pieces began to fall into place. And then, finally, he found it. The truth that changed everything. His father, a name that had always carried weight, always been synonymous with power and respect, but now carried a darkness he could no longer ignore. Decades ago, before Damien had even been born, his father had been involved in a ruthless business takeover. A company had been dismantled, its assets absorbed, and its founder, an ambitious entrepreneur, had been destroyed in the process. That entrepreneur had been Emilia's mother. Damien sat in his office, staring at the old files spread across his desk, his heart hammering in his chest. It wasn't just fate that had made Emilia wary of men like him. It wasn't just some personal fear or insecurity that had caused her to hesitate in trusting him. It was history, a history his own bloodline was responsible for. His family had ruined hers. The realization sent a wave of nausea through him. He thought back to every moment he had shared with Emilia, every time she had looked at him with uncertainty, every time she had pulled away as if some part of her knew she couldn't truly trust him. She had never known the full story, never realized just how deep the wound ran. But on some level, she had always felt it. And now, knowing the truth, Damien understood that if he ever wanted to make things right, if he ever wanted a chance at winning her back, it wouldn't be through empty apologies or grand gestures. It had to be through action, through change. For the first time in his life, he found himself wanting to be better. Not for power, not for control, but because she had shown him there was a different way to live. A way that didn't rely on manipulation and dominance, but on something far scarier, vulnerability. And so he made a choice. He tracked down the remnants of what had been stolen from Emilia's family. He found the shattered pieces of her mother's legacy, the scraps of a business that had been wiped from existence. And then, with a move that shocked even his closest advisors, he did something no one had ever expected of him. He gave it back. Not in secret, not behind closed doors, but in front of the world. In a press conference that sent ripples through the business world, Damien publicly admitted to the sins of his family. He laid out the truth, not sparing himself from blame, and he made it clear what had been stolen would be returned. He transferred ownership of the old assets, revived the company under Emilia's mother's name, and ensured that everything, every dollar, every share, every ounce of power belonged to Emilia. And he did it expecting nothing in return. For once, it wasn't about winning. It wasn't about convincing her to come back. It was about doing the right thing. The story spread like wildfire. Headlines exploded with his name, speculating on why a man like Damien would willingly give up such a fortune. Some called it madness, others a strategic move. But only one person truly mattered. Emilia. She saw it. She watched the press conference from a distance, unable to believe what she was hearing. For days, she had convinced herself that Damien was just another man driven by power, that he would never truly change. But as she listened to his words, as she saw the way he carried the weight of his family's sins without excuse, something inside her cracked. This wasn't just a performance. This wasn't just another game. This was real, and it terrified her. For so long, she had told herself that walking away was the right choice, that she had done the smart thing by leaving before he could break her completely. But now, as she saw the man he had become, the man he was choosing to be, she felt her carefully built walls beginning to crumble. When he finally stood before her again, face to face, there was no arrogance in his stance, no expectation in his eyes, only quiet determination. "I didn't do it to win you back," he told her, his voice raw. "I did it because you were right, because I wanted to be the kind of man you once thought I could be." She stared at him, searching for deception, for some hidden angle. But there was none. For the first time, he wasn't trying to possess her. He was setting her free. Tears burned at the back of her eyes. "Damien," he smiled just a little, "I won't ask you to forgive me. I won't ask you to come back. But I needed you to know that I love you, that I've always loved you, and that I'm done being the man who destroys the things he cares about." Emilia sucked in a shaky breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent so long guarding herself against him, but now she saw the truth. He wasn't just fighting for her. He had changed, and maybe, just maybe, she could too. She took a step closer. For the first time, she let her heart lead, and when Damien reached for her hand, she didn't pull away.